With the new Warframe update, we got our hands on 4 brand new augment mods. Some of them are good, some of them exist, but one definitely takes the cake. So in this overview, I'm gonna show you what all of them can do, how to best use them, and why I insisted on putting Ember's butt cheeks in the intro. Because it's fun, okay? Big shoutouts to all our beautiful channel members, and now, let's talk about it. Okay, the first augment that I want to talk about today would be for our snake man Lavos. That goes by the name Lingering Transmutation, and naturally, he is an augment for his third ability, Transmutation Probe. Just as a quick recap, Transmutation Probe shoots out a drone that zaps enemies in an AoE around it, and for every enemy that it hits, the cooldowns of all your abilities are going to be reduced a bit. So this is basically your cooldown management tool on Lavos. Now, what the augment Lingering Transmutation now does is that instead of just flying forward off into the sunset, your Transmutation Probe is gonna come back after a bit and then stay on the field in position until the duration has run out. Just one quick side note here, on the mod it says the probe returns to Lavos, but that's not true because what actually happens is the probe returns to the point at which you cast it, but if you move to somewhere else in the meantime, it is still not going to come back to you, it's going to go back to where it started. Just keep that one in mind for your positioning in the mission. Now, one more thing you can do is, instead of waiting for the probe to come back, you can also just tap the ability button again to force it to come back right away. You know, gives you a little bit more control. However, the real selling point of this is something that isn't even mentioned on the mod, and that is that with Lingering Transmutation, every zap this ability deals to an enemy will reduce your ability cooldown, whereas without the augment, you only get 1 tick of ability cooldown reduction per enemy. If it hits the same enemy multiple times, doesn't do anything. Now it does. And that is really darn strong, because it means if you cast it into a blob of enemies, then it will constantly keep the cooldowns of all your ability pretty much down at 0, allowing you to spam the ever-living heck out of them. Now, this sounds pretty overpowered, right? Well, yes and also no at the same time, because I personally think there is quite a bit more nuance to this than first meets the eye. Let me explain. See, on the one hand, if you are in an environment where a lot of enemies are constantly coming into the AoE of your Transmutation Probe, of course, it's absolutely ridiculous. It allows you to just set it up once and then spam your abilities all day long. But if you play a mission type that is not stationary, where you actually have to move through the tile set from A to B, something like Exterminate, Capture, and so on, then the whole thing is a bit more finicky to play because you need to constantly make sure that enemies are in that AoE, so you need to have a grouping tool or a grouping weapon, like for example the Sciatid, and fiddle around quite a bit, meaning your Transmutation Probe is not as set and forget anymore as it is in other situations. But, and this is the big but, and also the reason why I'm not 100% sold on this augment is that we already have an augment that helps us reduce our cooldowns in the form of Swift Bite for our first ability, Ophidian Bite. This one makes it that whenever we hit 4 or more enemies with a cast of this ability, all our ability cooldowns will be reduced. And while there is certainly a lot of variety in how you can build Lavos, one of the things that I have found to enjoy quite a lot is a build for a lot of efficiency, which basically allows you to spam Ophidian Bite all day long, and you wouldn't even need Lingering Transmutation. Now, of course, this setup is not perfect either, and I'm pretty sure there are going to be a lot of example builds out there which can't work in that way. So basically what I'm saying is, Lingering Transmutation certainly doesn't hurt Lavos, but you need to think very carefully whether it is really the best option for your personal build. Oh yeah, and as always, if you could maybe leave a quick like for the video, that'd be super nice. So cheers big time for your support. But yeah, up next, let's talk about our broken Warframe, our Frankenstein monster Xaku, with their new augment, Untime Rift, an augment for your 4th ability, the Vast Untime. Also here, quick recap, the Vast Untime is a major part of your kit. What it does is you shed your skin and turn into the spooky Warframe skeleton version, which will then freeze the duration of all your other abilities, make you much more survivable by giving you dodge chance, slow all the enemies in an area around you, and make them more vulnerable to void damage. This is something you usually cast quite a bit. Now, what the augment does is, whenever you cast this skill, you create a rift that will connect with like energy tendrils to all enemies in an AoE that are affected by void damage, and then it will basically double the debuffs that you inflict on the enemies with the 4th ability. So the damage vulnerability against void will be doubled, and also the slow. Now, when I first heard about this augment and saw the showcase, I thought this would be ridiculously broken. However, now that I've tested it on many builds, I think it won't be worth the mod slot, and I can also explain why. See, the augment only applies its effects to enemies that are already inflicted with void status effects. And the only way that you can inflict void status effects on the enemies with Xaku is, you have to use your first ability Xata's Whisper to imbue it onto your weapon and then hit the enemies with your weapon. That's the first downside, but it doesn't stop there. The second thing we need to ask ourselves is, what does this ability really give us? I mean, yes, it slows down enemies even more, and it also makes them more vulnerable to your void damage, aka your floaty guns, but then again, do you really need that extra damage? I mean, you already have an armor stripping ability in your 3, your floaty guns scale with enemy level, meaning they only get stronger and stronger as you go up, and most setups also mix in some sort of external viral priming. If you ask me, it's not really worth it to make a couple of enemies a bit weaker to the damage that will most likely completely annihilate them anyway. Long story short, in maybe certain specific niche scenarios where you would want to slow down specific enemies, yes, this augment could be useful, but for most builds out there, I personally don't think it's worth the mod slot, and I myself certainly will also not incorporate it into my personal Xaku builds. The next augment on our list today will be a bit of a shorter affair because it's very straightforward, and that would be Reverse Rotorswell, an augment for Gyre, specifically for her 4th ability, Rotorswell. Also here, quick recap, what does the Rotorswell ability even do? It creates an AoE around you in which enemies are zapped, and whenever you deal a critical hit to an enemy, there's gonna be another discharge against them and nearby enemies. Now, what does the augment Reverse Rotorswell do? Well, it makes it that when your Rotorswell is on and you take damage from an enemy, then a portion of that damage, 35% at base, capping out at a maximum of 75%, will be redirected to said enemy, and there's also a chance that you will deal an electricity status effect with this. Now, the first thing I want to mention here is that even though it is a damage redirection, I don't think that you actually use this augment for the damage. On the one hand, because the redirected damage is capped at 75%, and on the other hand, as Gyre, you have enough other ways to deal a ton of damage, you don't need to rely on this. No, the main reason why you use this, in my opinion, is for survivability. See, one thing that Rotorswell is really good at is zapping everybody in the AoE around you, which stuns them for a couple seconds, making them effectively unable to damage you. But of course, on bigger tile sets, there are enemies further away, which are not in the AoE of your Rotorswell, and they then can naturally hit you. However, the damage redirection from the augment, according to my testing, isn't limited by the actual ability's range and can redirect that damage portion to enemies that are even much further away, which means that you now not only keep the enemies in check that are close by, but also further away enemies, when they hit you, can be inflicted with that electricity, reducing incoming fire even more. Overall, I think the idea behind this is pretty cool. However, it should be noted that the base status chance of this augment is pretty darn low, so even with a lot of ability strength, you will likely not go beyond 30%. So I would say you just try it out and see for yourself whether you feel more survivable with it, and if not, then you just drop it again. And finally, I saved the creme de la creme for last, let's talk about Styanax, because the man, the legend, has been blessed with another augment, this one for his 2nd ability Tharros Strike. Augment's called Tharros Lethality, and it is by far the best of the 4. First of all, also hear the recap. What Tharros Strike does is pretty straightforward. When you cast it, enemies in a cone in front of you will have both their armor as well as their shields reduced. With a little bit of ability strength investment, that reduction goes up to 100%. Overall, it is a great defense reduction tool, and it is also Styanax's helmet ability, which means you can put it onto any other Warframe, and it's also pretty commonly used, especially against single big high-value targets that other armor stripping abilities sometimes don't. Now, what the Tharros Lethality augment does is, it increases your critical damage against the enemies that you hit with the Tharros strike, and that crit damage bonus is even doubled when you're wielding a spear gun type of weapon. Now, this spear gun type of thing is of course based on Styanax's gimmick, because he is basically meant to be the spear gun frame, but I think even if you don't use a spear gun, this augment is absolutely ridiculous. First of all, the crit damage bonus works like a crit damage mod, so it's kinda like you have a second vital sense on your weapon, but the 100% base crit damage bonus scales with ability strength, so if your strength is high, then you can easily get that bonus to over 300%, which is mental if we remember this is your helmet ability. You can give that to every Warframe. So yeah, I personally think we're gonna see this augment quite a lot, on Styanax himself of course, but also on other setups that use his Tharros strike as a subsume, because it plays even further into the strengths of this skill of weakening the big high priority targets so that we can dispose of them much easier. And for all the info on the brand new Warframe Noko, check out this video next. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, TheKengineer 2, Skyla Bowser, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hantares, Patrasator, Boomy1, Zave, Alwindai, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.